Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev, where today we're continuing work on our Phasmophobia cross-minute mashup. Now, last time we expanded on the previously difficult endeavor of adding camera mechanics. The changes allowed new items such as the bone and voodoo dolls to be photographed, and those items themselves had special behaviors coded so that the player could not only pick them up but also kick them around. Other interactables such as salt were added, pushing us one step closer to finally adding more ghost-centric interactions to the game, which just so happens to also be part of today's plan. We'll be adding a bunch of remaining tools to the game, some of which will finally require us to make the death timer a thing. We'll also start fleshing out the ghost side of things by adding a quirk system, and we'll attempt to tie all these elements together in a way that doesn't break anything. Sounds like a plan, so let's get to the coding. First, fingerprint evidence was officially added. Fingerprints would only be visible if the player has a UV flashlight in their inventory. I decided to go this route instead of Phasmophobia's quote-unquote reveal method due to the frenetic nature of our game. Between the lack of time, the monochrome, and the need to look for both fingerprints and footprints, it felt like enough of a challenge. Anyway, with that working, we could now add our next item, the strong flashlight. Just like in Phasmophobia, the strong flashlight is basically a stronger version of the standard flashlight, which would be reflected in a larger beam of light sprite. The code ended up working fine, however the new larger beam of light needs to be redone, because it actually feels worse to use than the standard light. I also totally forgot to render a beam for the UV light anyway. However, the code was working, so we could move on. Next up were what I call the ghost quirks, which for now were simply whether they leave behind footprints or fingerprints. I had planned to add more, but I apparently did not actually note down specific behavior quirks for each ghost. Then for the time being, if a ghost is capable of leaving fingerprints, they would do so on nearby walls, which annoyingly ended up taking a bit of time because I forgot that evidence objects are pulled. But one facepalm later and the ghost was in fact able to leave behind some fingerprint evidence when next to a wall. And so with that working, we could move on. But before we could add anything else, we would need to finally incorporate the death timer. So a counter was created which would count down to exactly 1 minute. This was then reflected in that bar which has been sitting on top of the game screen this entire episode. And yes, I sat there for a whole minute just to make sure that my math was right, which sadly just goes to show how little confidence I have in my mathing ability at this point. But anyway, that was indeed working, so we could get back to adding more items. Next up was the cross, which was going to be tricky. Crosses had two uses before they would be destroyed, which needed to be coded into our existing tool object. Initially, a usage variable was added to the tool object through a function, which did not work. So instead I opted for something unconventional. A timer was added to the tool object, and when a cross is dropped within range of the ghost's origin point, this would trigger the timer. When the timer hits 0, the item state is set from false to true, and the timer is also reset. When the timer hits 0 for the second time, the cross is destroyed, thus allowing the cross to only exist for 2 uses. The death timer would also have time added back every reset or destroy event. This is only possible due to the fact that the player cannot toggle a cross on and off. So even if the player picks up the cross on the second countdown, the usage is consistent due to the state variable. And what's great about this little hack is that the smudge sticks, which are single use, could use the exact same system without any added code. This is because smudge sticks only work when active, thus skipping the entire first usage round. And with that was sadly all the time I had for this session. I also had to cut the session short so I could go research some ghost quirks for my notes. And there's also a whole bunch of new things that we're going to need, such as fixes to the lighting, before we can add any of the remaining last bits to the visuals. So it feels like we're getting close to the end, however we still have the ghost behaviors to get to, as well as figuring out just how the death timer and gameplay loop will work. But for now, that brings us to the end of today's episode of Let's Delve. So remember to leave a like if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, and leave your thoughts on our progress in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.